Well, good afternoon. I want to welcome everyone to today's December edition of the WIRES webinar series. And I'm very proud and pleased to introduce today our speaker, Norman Bay. Many of you are already well familiar with Norman's background, but for those of you who are not, Norman has a long and impressive career in both academia and public service. Norman is a former professor from the University of New Mexico School of Law. As I mentioned, he also has a distinguished background in public service. Norman was a federal prosecutor and the U.S. Attorney for the District of New Mexico. And more recently, he served as the Director of the Office of Enforcement at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission prior to becoming a commissioner at FERC, and then ultimately serving as the chairman of the commission. And it was my privilege to be able to work with Norman during his time at FERC while he was in enforcement and as chairman. Now, Norman has moved into the private sector. He's a partner at the law firm of Willkie Farr Gallagher. And we're really pleased to have Norman here today to talk to us about the topic of electrification and its impact on the grid. And I'd like to mention to all of the participants, you do have the opportunity to submit questions for Norman through the question function on the right-hand portion of your screen. If you click on the little segment that says questions, you can type it and submit it. And then we'll be able to go through those questions with Norman once he's gone through his presentation. So I really want to strongly encourage people to submit questions. We've allowed some time at the end of the presentation to go over those with Norman. So without any further delay, Norman, I want to welcome you to this WIRES webinar, and we look forward to hearing your thoughts on this topic.
Well, thank you, Larry. Thank you for the kind introduction, and thank you for inviting me to this WIRES meeting. I think the work of WIRES and its members is more important than ever as we think about electrification and the grid. It's a subject of great interest to me, and I think we're going to be looking at some pretty exciting times going forward, both with respect to the build out of more renewables, but also the transmission that will be needed to support the renewables. So let me talk about some of the key themes that I'm going to be discussing in today's talk. For sure, more renewables. And those renewables will not only be onshore, but offshore. With respect to offshore wind, the states on the East Coast have planned to put in double-digit gigawatt amounts of wind up and down the eastern seaboard. And at some point, there may even be offshore wind off the West Coast as the cost of floating turbines continues to fall. Then another key theme, the Biden administration, and what does that mean for the grid? Clearly, the Biden administration has signaled that it has made climate change a priority, and that a key means of addressing climate change will be through electrification. The Biden administration has also indicated its interest in what the president-elect has called Build Back Better, involving the investment of $2 trillion in the U.S. economy, particularly in infrastructure and in clean energy resources. All of which points to the role and importance of transmission. In my view, the Biden administration is deeply aware of and appreciative of the role of transmission in facilitating the integration of renewables, which takes us to this next trend, future opportunities and needs. Clearly, there will be many. But how do we build that transmission? And that takes us to policy options for Congress and for FERC. And I've tried to list a number of options here, some of which I think are going to be difficult to achieve and really a pretty heavy lift, and some of which may be much easier, not requiring legislation, but rather using the existing authorities of FERC and the Department of Energy. And finally, one last theme, I think FERC will need to act with a sense of urgency and resolve. And so I'm happy to discuss all of these themes in this talk today. But of course, we know that we're living in this time of dramatic change. Don't need to tell anybody on the call that that's happening. This past year, renewables accounted for about 17, 18% of the electricity on the grid. Nuclear was the remaining another 20%. So about 38% of electricity on the grid is currently carbon-free. But that means that there's a lot of electricity out there that still produces carbon emissions. And that's relevant because the Biden administration has announced a plan of 0 by 35. That is 0 carbon emissions from the power industry by 2035. So that 62% delta is what would have to change. There would have to be this substitution of carbon-free electricity for the electricity that currently emits carbon emissions. So a time of dramatic change, but with more change on the way. If you look at the next slide, it indicates how even in this past year in 2020, the EIA projects that 76% of the new capacity on the grid will be renewables, with the remainder basically being natural gas. And that's consistent with trends over the last 4 or 5 years, where half or more of the new installed capacity was renewables. And this matters when you're thinking about carbon emissions, as this next slide indicates. This is from the EPA. It's from 2018, and it shows that presently more carbon emissions are coming from the transportation sector than from the power industry. And that trend first began in 2016. In 2016, when that happened, that was a first, well, not exactly a first, but the last time it happened prior to 2016 was in the late 1970s. So that shows you how far the power industry has come along in reducing its carbon emissions. Now, when you think about transportation, it's particularly important to recognize that light-duty vehicles account for 59% of the emissions from the transportation sector, and that medium and heavy-duty trucks account for another 23%. So more than 80% of the emissions from the transportation sector are from vehicles that are currently using gasoline or diesel. And that's why I think policymakers have been focusing on electrification of surface transportation, particularly light, medium, and heavy-duty vehicles, as a way of continuing to decarbonize the economy. And then there's commercial and residential emissions as well, oftentimes from space heating. And so that has also resulted in many thinking that electrification could be helpful there. And then certain industrial processes could be electrified as well. So one question could be, how fast will this change happen, right? And here's one data point for you that continues to amaze me. You may recall the EPA's Clean Power Plan. It was issued in August of 2015. At the time it was issued, it was very controversial. And I know that personally because at the time it was being considered, I was on the commission, and FERC agreed to hold a series of technical conferences around the country to examine the impacts of the Clean Power Plan on the grid. In some of the technical conferences, some stakeholders said that the Clean Power Plan was essentially impossible to achieve. I can still remember one witness saying that the Clean Power Plan could not be achieved by 2030, could not be achieved by 2040, and might not ever be achievable, right? And the Clean Power Plan called for a 32% reduction in carbon emissions from 2005 levels by 2030. What happened? It was so controversial that litigation immediately ensued after the rule was issued. A federal court issued a stay. The Clean Power Plan was never implemented, and ultimately the Trump administration repealed it, and replaced it. Fast forward to 2019, at the national level, the United States met the goals of the Clean Power Plan, a more than 32% reduction from 2005 levels. In other words, 11 years ahead of schedule, the United States met the national goals of the Clean Power Plan. It's really kind of amazing as I look back on the technical conferences we held and the stakeholder input, and then to realize that the progress, the change happened that quickly. So what will happen under a Biden administration? I think one thing for sure is that climate change is going to be a priority, and that a Biden administration is going to ask all federal agencies to work on addressing climate change. So throughout the campaign, President-elect Biden made clear that climate change was one of his top priorities. So one of the policies that he announced was the 0 by 35 policy, zero carbon emissions from the power industry by 2035. And then for the United States to be net zero carbon emissions economy-wide by 2050. I would also expect the Biden administration on day one to announce that the United States is rejoining the Paris Accords. So not only will the Biden administration try to address climate change, not only is that going to be a priority, but that's also going to be coupled with what President-elect Biden has called his Build Back Better plan, $2 trillion investment in infrastructure in the United States. That would include support for EVs and building out 500,000 charging outlets, support for infrastructure, including transmission and zero emission public transit, and then a huge investment in clean energy and innovation over the next 10 years. So clearly, directionally, the Biden plan recognizes not only the need for more renewables, but also the infrastructure to support the renewables, including transmission. So I think that's why the work that you and all the members of WIRES are doing is going to be so important over the next few years. Let's look at what will happen with electrification. So this was a study by NREL in 2018 that modeled 3 different cases, a base case, a medium case, and a high case with respect to electrification. Under the base case, load growth would increase by 0.65% a year. In a medium case, it would be 1.2%, and in a high case, it would be 1.6%. And as the NREL study notes, the high case would result in an increase in annual electricity consumption of 80 terawatt hours per year, which would be historically unprecedented growth. So, whether you're looking at a base case, a medium case, or a high case, for sure, there's going to be a lot more load on the system. And because that load will have to be supplied by low carbon resources, many of those resources will need to be developed. As I mentioned, there's a 62% delta right now, even if you just look at current installed capacity. And so you're going to need the transmission to develop those renewables to load. So certainly a key fact when you think about transmission is its importance in integrating renewables. NREL produced this slide a few years ago that basically delineates options for integrating renewables. And this is just, I think, a very, very helpful slide. But when you look at the 6 different options, starting on the left, you've got system operations, i.e. the market rules. Then you have markets, right, which have load and resource diversity. Then you have load or load management, including DR. Next, you have flexible generation. And so there's certainly a lot of discussion at energy conferences on the need for flexible resources. And then you have networks or transmission. And I think it's important that policymakers recognize everywhere, recognize the importance of transmission. And finally, you have energy storage. So when you're integrating the renewables, you want to have the network that can support it. And studies have been done, certainly, on the way in which networks could be built out to support a low carbon grid. This is really a great study that NREL did in 2018. And the study was posted on the web for a while, and then I think it has since disappeared, but I'm hopeful that at some point it reemerges. But essentially, NREL modeled a number of different cases involving the build out of the grid. And the spectrum went from kind of a lower amount of build to basically a maximum amount of build in terms of trying to think about the grid of the future and the eastern-western interconnects. The really, I think, notable conclusion of this study was that regardless of the scenario modeled, the benefits far outweighed the costs. And so I think this study actually has been very influential, even if it can't be found nowadays on the web. I mean, with respect to the benefits, it's not only integrating renewables, but it's also the economic benefit, reliability, resiliency, all of that, and of course, public policy. So I think that this is well understood, deeply understood, and appreciated by the incoming administration. So let's look at the investments in the grid that would be needed in order to facilitate a significant build out of the grid and really to give us the grid that we need in this low carbon future. The one study that I'm aware of is the Brattle Group, and probably everyone in wires is aware of this study, so I won't spend too much time on it. But according to Brattle, basically, there would have to be a significant investment, incremental investment or additional investment in transmission by 2030. Brattle estimated that it could be anywhere from $30 to $90 billion by 2030. And then from 2030 to 2050, 200 to 600 billion more. And of course, that only looks at the grid. I think if you're looking at electrification, you probably, well, not probably, you'll need to beef up the distribution system, particularly if you have a high EV future that includes V1G or V2G and more DER. Certainly storage can be a grid level asset. And so, you know, those are additional investments that could be very helpful going forward. So the thing is, though, as we all know, transmission is hard, right? So it's one thing to recognize the need, but we know that transmission is hard. And this slide was actually in the original NREL slide deck. And it just really kind of captured my imagination, because here we have the Bureau of Reclamation in 1952 boldly proclaiming that this Western grid will inevitably come. And of course, in 1952, this plan was intended to allow for the greater use of coal resources. So ironically, of course, now we're talking about renewables, not coal, but the idea is the same, that you've got these regions of the country that are rich in resources, and how do we get the electricity that they produce to the big load centers? And but as we know, transmission is hard. So why is it hard? There's the cost allocation issue. Everyone understands the value of transmission, but when it comes time to pay, no one wants to pay. Then there's the issue of planning. Order 1000 was meant to streamline the process for regional and interregional planning, But I think everyone would agree that that it's been a disappointment, that the results at best have been mixed, that not a single interregional line has been identified and built under Order 1000. In other words, the kind of line that we most need for the future. Then there are siting issues and just the difficulty of having to navigate through the regulatory process in every state, which has to give approval to a line. And all of that leads to time, the time that it takes to complete these projects, where it is not uncommon for a big line to take a decade to build. And so there's a lot of capital out there that would like to build transmission, but in between, the cost allocation issues, the planning process, the siting hoops, the time that it takes to build the lines, and the uncertainty, that capital is not being deployed. And so that clearly has to be something that the new administration will have to focus on. And then, of course, I would say another issue, and I put this with a question mark, politics. At least traditionally, there has been bipartisan support for infrastructure. The question is, will that hold up in this time of polarization? Regardless of who controls the Senate, can the Dems and the Rs agree on some sort of legislation that facilitates the build out of transmission? And for me, the overriding question is this. There's that wonderful slide of all those NREL studies, but what would allow us to build the grid of the future? So what policies would allow us to build to the scenarios that NREL has modeled? And with the one thing that we know for sure is that the current policies would make that kind of development almost impossible. So short of building the grid out, there are some things that I think FERC can consider. One is optimizing the capacity of existing infrastructure. And FERC did a technical conference on grid enhancing technologies and then issued its transmission incentives NOPR that provides some pretty modest financial incentives for using GETs. And then more recently, FERC has followed up that NOPR with another one on managing transmission congestion that might pave the way at some point for the use of dynamic line ratings, but otherwise has some incremental steps in there to try to increase the use of the available capacity on the grid. But clearly, I think policymakers may focus on ways of optimizing the existing capacity before turning to ways of building it out. The thing is, though, even if you optimize the capacity of existing infrastructure, for this really big build out of the grid with more renewables, you are going to need more transmission. And I think everyone agrees to that. Another option for increasing the capacity of the existing infrastructure, it's been interesting to follow this, is FERC's recognition that energy storage can be a transmission asset and can be eligible for cost recovery. So that I think is very helpful. We've seen that policy reflected in a recent MISO filing. And my sense is that other RTOs will be doing the same. And that can be helpful, again, for managing congestion on a system and optimizing its capacity. So now let's look at different options. So let's start with legislative options. I think the one at the top of the list, if you could get it done, that would make the most difference, is Congress basically passing a law that allows for the development of a national transmission plan with an agency having the authority to plan and develop the grid of the future, whether you call that a national super grid or something else. But clearly, to get that kind of law passed, you're going to need bipartisan support. And the question is, can you make that happen, right? And I would think that that kind of legislation should also give the authority siting authority, so that if there is a line that's very important for the public interest, the agency should have the ability to secure the land as well. And clearly there would have to be some sort of public-private partnership here. The government's not going to build the line and run it. Probably a less significant lift, an easier lift, would be some sort of tax credit, maybe an investment tax credit for transmission. If there is such a measure, my sense is it probably wouldn't be across the board. Rather, it would be more targeted, perhaps for interregional lines or certain kinds of high voltage lines. But this too could be helpful in terms of incentivizing the development of the grid. This next option, enhanced siting authority, I think is an important one, but probably a very difficult, if not impossible, lift. As you know, the NGA gives FERC siting authority for gas pipelines that have been certificated. And the NGA has had that feature for decades now. The FPA, however, does not have a similar authority for FERC. That's a pretty significant for gas relative to electricity. But I think, as helpful as it would be for FERC to have siting authority, this is probably a big lift because many states would object on sovereignty grounds and would not want to cede siting authority to FERC or any other federal agency. Further down the list, but still helpful, and these are much more incremental tweaks, would be dealing with some cases that I think have been problematic for FERC over the years. One is Piedmont Environmental Council versus FERC. This was a Fourth Circuit decision that essentially gutted FERC's backstop siting authority under Section 216 of the FPA. Section 216 gives DOE the ability or the authority to designate national interest electric transmission corridors. Once DOE designates these national corridors, the ball goes to FERC's court with respect to the potential siting of that project. Piedmont gutted the authority because it held that a state does not withhold approval for more than 1 year if it denies the request within a year. And so FERC basically then was left with no siting authority at all. So getting Congress basically to tweak the statute to make clear that FERC then could exercise its authority when a state refuses to permit a line would be very, very helpful. That withholding approval includes its denial, in other words. Then there are the Illinois Commerce Commission cases. There was Illinois Commerce Commission 1 and Illinois Commerce Commission 2, both 2-to-1 decisions written by Judge Posner with Judge Cudahy dissenting. And these decisions, unfortunately, I think have created the present situation we have with cost allocation because they called into question FERC's use of postage stamp cost allocation for high voltage transmission. Instead, FERC has to do a more granular analysis to try to identify the beneficiaries so that the beneficiaries shoulder the load. But I think for most of us on this call today, we would argue that high voltage transmission provides benefits to everyone within a region. And as a result, the cost should be broadly allocated. Unfortunately, because of these cases out of the Seventh Circuit, FERC and stakeholders have to jump through all kinds of hoops and do backflips and the like in order to justify the cost allocation And even then, it's almost always subject to litigation. So it exacerbates the problem that we've already discussed about how people recognize abstractly the value of transmission, but no one wants to pay. Well, let's look at options for FERC. So one is revisiting Order 1000, which, as I noted earlier, I think everyone recognizes has not lived up to its lofty promise. I can remember when Order 1000 was issued and the headlines in the trade press about how this was going to be, this landmark order. And unfortunately, I think most of us would say that just hasn't happened. And the last time FERC did a tech conference on Order 1000, believe it or not, was so long ago that I was still the chairman of FERC. It was in the summer of 2016. And at that tech conference, many stakeholders said, look, we think it's working, just give us more time. Well, I think 4 more years is plenty enough time to figure out what's working and what's not working. And maybe FERC just has to be more directive with respect to Order 1000, particularly with respect to interregional planning and cost allocation, where FERC promoted it or encouraged it, but didn't really mandate it. And so maybe now FERC has to be more directive. A second option, convincing DOE to transfer its Section 216 authority to designate these national corridors to FERC. This is something that former Chairman Wellinghoff tried to get done. He wasn't able to do it. I tried to do it. I wasn't able to do it. But the problem is that given the current structure, there's this gating process where first DOE has to go through the process of identifying the national corridor, whereupon the responsibility then lands with FERC. But you could streamline a lot of that by just giving it to FERC. And FERC has the institutional and experience and expertise to get infrastructure done. And there are a lot of staff in the Office of Energy Projects who certainly know how to do NEPA studies. So I think it makes a lot of sense to transfer that authority to FERC if DOE's willing to part with it. Then another option, as it has for decades now, continuing to promote the expansion of RTO markets. Look, transmission planning and cost allocation is hard, period, but I think it happens better in the RTO markets than it does in the bilateral markets. And with the really big regional markets, it's just much easier to build lines that are crossing state lines than it would be trying to build some sort of merchant line across several different states that aren't members of an RTO market. So I would say that the benefits of transmission planning are greater in RTO markets than bilateral markets, and that FERC should continue to really encourage the expansion of RTO markets. Another option, and this one is easy for chairman, creating a transmission policy and planning branch at FERC, and perhaps putting that in OPI. Presently, there are staff in a number of different program offices who would work on transmission issues, but maybe it makes sense just to have a single branch doing that. If nothing else, I think it sends a message, and I think the optics are very helpful. And that branch could also coordinate with DOE and other federal agencies. I've even wondered whether a branch like that could basically plan and announce that it believes, and this would be through the commission, of course, or through a staff white paper, that certain lines would be very helpful in addressing future grid needs. And that would then create basically some momentum, perhaps, for stakeholders to take that idea and to run with it, knowing that this was an idea that FERC staff considered to be very, very helpful. As I was looking at recently the pipeline siting policy statement, at least one of the options there was for FERC to do the planning for the pipelines and to identify where pipelines were needed, and then to put those needs out there for a competitive bidding process. I'm not saying FERC should do that here, but I was struck by the fact that FERC, under that option, which was not adopted, but under that option would have done much more planning than it currently does. Under the, on the gas side now, FERC depends upon the market to identify need. But it makes me think that there isn't a statutory impediment to FERC being more proactive and helping industry, as well as the regional and interregional planning groups, get their arms around projects that should be considered. If nothing else, I think if FERC were to do that, if FERC staff were to do that, it would certainly send a reminder and maybe get the wheels turning in different planning bodies around the country. Then I think FERC should finalize its transmission incentive policy, although perhaps there should be more tweaks so that the analysis is not so backward looking and only focused on the economics, but also more fully taking into account a public policy, because there's no doubt that different state policies are driving a lot of the growth of renewables around the U.S. Then FERC should complete its rulemaking on managing transmission line ratings and perhaps be a little bit more proactive with respect to dynamic line ratings, as opposed to, I think, taking this very incremental approach that it has. The last option, I think, is to really support DOE in its use of its Section 1222 authority in EPAC 2005. This authority was used by Clean Line when it was trying to build its line. Ultimately, in December of 2017, there was a decision by a federal district court in Arkansas that upheld DOE's use of that authority, but it would allow WAPA and SWAPA to build new transmission in this public-private partnership in any state in which they operate. And when you look at a map showing where WAPA and SWAPA operate, they virtually cover the whole of the United States. I mean, there are a few states they don't, but they cover a big swath of the United States. And so I think that's an option worth considering too. And along those lines, I just want to call to everyone's attention an article by Avi Zevin, Sam Walsh, Justin Goonlock, and Isabel Carey called "Building a New Grid Without New Legislation, A Path to Revitalizing Federal Transmission Authorities." But the authors basically argue that Section 22 or 1222 amounts to a sleeping giant of sorts, and that an administration that really wants to support transmission development and wants to overcome these siting issues could rely upon Section 1222. But they also point out the difficulties and the questions that haven't yet been addressed by the courts. But it's an article, I think, well worth reading by anyone who's interested in transmission policy and development. And finally, for my next slide and last slide, in my view, FERC has to act with a sense of urgency and resolve. We all know more renewables are on the way. The only question is how much more. And we know that it takes a long time to do a rulemaking, easily 2 years, sometimes longer. For example, Order 2x4-2222 was issued in November of 2016 and it got finalized in September of 2020. Now that might be a record because it was almost 4 years, but the typical rulemaking easily can take 2 years to complete. And then when you look at the build out, the actual construction of transmission, again, that can be a very, very long process indeed. And so if you're really serious about the 0 by 35 goal, in my view, there's not a moment to lose. And there's this wonderful quote from Bill Gates, where Bill Gates has said, "We always overestimate the change that will occur in the next 2 years and underestimate the change that will occur in the next 10. Don't let yourself be lulled into inaction. Well, Larry, that's all I've got to say with respect to my slide deck, and I'm happy to have a discussion with you about any questions you or your members might have.
Well, great. Thanks, Norman. You clearly haven't lost your professorial touch now that you've been in the law firm. I thought that was really great, very comprehensive, and very informative. And I want to remind the participants that they can submit questions. I can see a couple of them are already coming in. So you've definitely got some people thinking, Norman, which is good. And I'll just start off. I liked the way you ended with the emphasis on the sense of urgency, because that's a theme that I've been trying to strike for the last year or so, and that WIRES has been continuing to promote. You're right, given that some of these goals are now set for 2035, which to a lot of people that may sound like a long way off, but for people who are building transmission, if you're looking at taking a 8, 9, 10-year lead time to get projects off the ground, go through the permitting and siting process, get them built and actually get in service, that 8 or 9, 10-year period, we're already pushing the envelope on that. So I definitely agree with that. I guess one question I'd have with you is, do you have any suggestions on what the best way is for organizations like WIRES or people interested in this issue to engage policymakers, people at FERC, at DOE, or up on the Hill on trying to push forward on some of these issues? Do you have any thoughts on that?
I think you continue doing the great outreach you already do. I think you meet with the commissioners and go in there with I think specific asks, like suggestions, right? And see if you can get them on board. I think you're going to find many of the commissioners, if not all of them, very supportive. And so that's the FERC piece of things, just doing that outreach, and of course also talking to staff, because as you and I have often discussed, Larry, staff is critical. Commissioners come and go, but staff can be there for decades. I think you do the outreach to DOE, and then I think you also do some outreach to other federal agencies that might be a little bit more off the radar, but has significant authorities in their own right. For example, BLM at the Department of Interior, because BLM has designated energy corridors, which can be used for the development of transmission. I think you meet with maybe Department of Transportation to explore whether certain easements that railroads or other existing infrastructure currently possess could also be used for transmission. But just keep doing that outreach, keep educating people. I do think that one huge benefit for WIRES and its members is that the Biden administration gets transmission. They understand the importance of developing the grid if they want to have the grid of the future.
Sorry, I was on mute for a second there. Well, good, thanks. One of the questions that I've gotten from one of our participants is really kind of on this aspect of focusing on interregional transmission. And the question why there seems to be so much focus on interregional when we have some really large regions already in either MISO or PJM or SPP, and we can't get transmission built even within those regions because of cost allocation issues. So the question really was, wouldn't it be better to focus on intra-regional first? And there are different examples you can look at, but for instance, maybe a request from somebody from an entity in New Jersey about transmission in PJM, which could deal with a regional issue within the PJM region. So it's this, thinking big or broader inter-regional. Is that the better approach, or should you focus more on intra-regional and then expand out from there with some successes?
I think you've got to do both. I mean, for sure, there are problems with intra-regional planning and cost allocation. And, I read the same orders that you do, where, the commission and stakeholders just go through backflips to try to justify cost allocation. Unfortunately, those issues, are difficult to resolve given those Seventh Circuit decisions. But I still think you gotta keep plugging away there. But also I think you need to think about the interregional ones as well. I mean, you've got to do both in my view. Although I certainly recognize that that intra-regional transmission has its own challenges.
Another question I got, and this is a little bit more focused, it was just simply if you could again share the title of that article that you referenced that you said came out recently.
Yeah. So as I understand it, it's coming out in the next few weeks, but I was able to get an advanced copy. But it's called "Building a New Grid Without New Legislation: A Path to Revitalizing Federal Transmission Authorities." So there's a lot of discussion in the article on Section 216, 1222, the authority of the PMAs, and then some of the ways in which other agencies could be helpful as well.
Yeah, I'm interested in that too, because I think certainly with the potential for there to be a divided Congress, the potential for legislative solutions gets a little bit more complicated, clearly, and it could shift the focus more towards solutions that don't rely on legislation to get things done, rather than hope that you can get things happening up on Capitol Hill. So I think a lot of us are going to be interested in reading more about that. And the other question that I got, and I'm not sure exactly where this is going, but could you elaborate more on your bullet regarding SWAPA and WAPA building transmission?
So under Section 1222, there can be public-private partnerships where SWAPA and WAPA can build transmission lines through any state in which they operate. And the line doesn't actually have to be like through federal lands, but this is a pretty significant authority. It has only been used once, and that was by Clean Line when it was trying to build out its big line. And ultimately, Clean Line dropped the project because it couldn't find basically the off-takers for the capacity for the line. And so it's never actually resulted in a project being built, and yet this law remains on the books. So it's a pretty significant authority because arguably this authority gives the government the ability not only to acquire the land, but also to use eminent domain if it has to. And so that could help resolve the siting issues.
Okay. I got another one. I knew this was going to spark some interest because I even had some questions about it too. This goes back to your suggestion about FERC coming up with a transmission planning branch. And the question is, what do you think they would actually do at FERC? So FERC staff does not have planning expertise. What would be the objective of the planning efforts? Reliability, economics, public policy? And finally, how do you think the states would react to a project planned by FERC? Asked with a degree of skepticism, I think, the costs of which would be allocated to customers in the states.
You kind of cut out there for just a little bit, Larry.
Oh, sorry.
I heard you, last thing I heard was that, there could be skepticism.
Yeah, just that there could be skepticism among the states about a plan coming out of FERC. And then the states being asked to deal with the costs allocated from that kind of a plan.
Yeah, these are great questions. I mean, so I would regard the branch as being for policy and planning. But even if FERC hasn't done the planning before in the past, I think it could do so. And even if the plan that staff issues in a white paper is not adopted in a regional or interregional planning process, I think it does put a marker out there. And it might even be helpful to merchant transmission developer just to see what staff has already indicated, because it could signal FERC openness to that kind of line. So I think there could be a lot of benefit to it. And I don't think planning, I mean, certainly it requires expertise, but I think FERC has that kind of technical expertise in abundance, even if it hasn't actually planned transmission lines.
The next question kind of focuses on these issues from a different angle, one that we've pushed a little bit as well, which is national security. And it says, why can't national security be used to move the importance of electricity into the same space as gas pipelines? It seems like a simple and logical connection for different reasons. And what would need to be done in order to try to achieve this?
Well, you know, with respect to the previous question, Larry, I do think the state piece of things is very important. And it's not like FERC hasn't had its battles with the states recently. So I think you'd have to be very transparent about what you do and do lots of outreach to the state. And you know, if it's only planning and policy, then I think you make that clear to states, and that it's not resolving these cost allocation issues or other things. But it may be that some states want to participate in this kind of process because they want that line to be built. So I think it might be an idea worth exploring, you know. But while we're all brainstorming here, the other question on national security, you know, you would still have to tie the exercise of authority to some sort of specific congressional authorization. And I don't know whether some sort of national security legislation is out there that permits FERC to designate the need for certain kinds of transmission and to basically require that it be built. I'm a little skeptical that there is such an authority, but if one of your members knows otherwise, I'm certainly happy to take a look at that statute.
One question here is on the zero carbon for the electricity sector by 2035. How will reliability be accommodated if we need to run GTs occasionally to keep the lights on, assuming that there may not be enough hydro or battery capability?
Yeah, and this is one of the big questions, right? Because the goal is certainly an ambitious one, and I think many people would say that getting to 80%, maybe even 90% carbon free is doable, and it's that last 10 or 20% that's going to be hard. You know, storage I think continues to advance, so we'll see what happens there. But you know, I'm myself am pretty interested in hydrogen nowadays. It's such a interesting and flexible energy carrier, and so the idea of using hydrogen for medium-term and long-term storage, I think actually might hold a lot of promise, because it's not competing then as a fuel for like vehicles, right? Where the comparison would be, you know, a gallon of gas versus a kilo of hydrogen. Rather, it's competing against other forms of energy storage. And if the price of hydrogen continues to fall, green hydrogen, and apparently about 60% of the cost of green hydrogen is related to the cost of electricity. But if the price of green hydrogen really can be driven down, then, you know, maybe it's very cost competitive as a form of medium and long-term storage. So we'll have to see. I mean, certainly I can tell you that there is a tremendous amount of interest out there in hydrogen in the private equity world and elsewhere. So we'll see what happens.
So one question is, you know, to the extent that some of these goals or objectives rely on FERC action, you know, as we head into 2021, we're heading into a bit of a challenging situation and scenario with FERC. You know, we're going to look at a change in chairmanship, likely in late January. To the extent that there may just be disagreements among the commissioners on some of these different proposals, you know, you may be looking at a situation where you have a 2-3 basically, which won't advance it. I guess I'm curious as to your thinking. If you were back in your old seat at the commission, trying to run things as chairman, how would you handle that situation with trying to make these types of changes or advance these types of programs or policies in that situation?
Yeah, and a few things. I mean, you have to look for the bipartisan agreement where you can. And I think traditionally FERC has been very supportive of infrastructure, and I think that's still going to be the case. And FERC has also been supportive of markets and competition. And so the expansion of RTO markets, for example, would be something that I think unites both the Democrats and the Republicans. And then I would say you can't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. I mean, you know, when you're trying to reach these bipartisan agreements and get the buy-in, you know, if your colleague wants a certain kind of tweak to your proposal, look, you know, if your proposal basically otherwise, you know, accomplishes most of what you want it to, I think that sounds like a deal. I mean, you know, so you can't let the perfect be any good. You got to do a lot of outreach, and you have to build the support. So, but I think it's doable if FERC focuses on the areas in which it traditionally has sought to advance the public interest. And I think of that as being markets and competition, you know, infrastructure, innovation, all of those good things. And so if that remains kind of FERC's traditionally bipartisan approach, then I think you can get things done.
Yeah, I chuckled a little bit only because I think I may have heard you use that phrase, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good, once or twice over the time I worked with you at FERC, Norman, and I think it's great advice.
Yeah.
I'm going to try and squeeze in one more because we're running out of time here. The last question we've got is, we have more questions, but the last one we're going to have time for today is, do you see Order 1000 expanding to include a competitive solicitation for the East Coast offshore grid that's going to be needed to be built? And if you do, how do you think that would impact incumbent utilities?
You know, that's a really interesting question, and I don't know the answer to it. You know, New Jersey just issued an RFP, and it's going to be a competitive process, but it did it through a PJM tariff provision that actually allows states to sponsor the development of transmission. So it is a competitive process. It's kind of related to Order 1000, but it isn't really, I guess. So there may be workarounds one way or the other. So whether it's Order 1000 or whether it's using through, you know, some sort of state option in an RTO tariff, there's probably a way of making that subject to a competitive process. But you know, we're kind of in uncharted territory with respect to the offshore transmission, just because it hasn't been built out before. But I would think that there's probably a way of interpreting Order 1000 to make a competitive process possible.
Well, thanks, Norman. I'm gonna clearly need to follow up on that article you mentioned, because I have a couple of people asking questions about it that are definitely interested in it. But I want to thank you for taking your time to talk to us today about some of these issues. I found this really interesting, very helpful, and very informative. Again, really appreciate you doing this. And I want to thank everybody who tuned in, and we're going to wrap it up. And thanks again, Norman.
Thanks, Larry.
Right. Thanks, everybody.